Hello, all. Thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening and welcome to our Coexistence and Practice webinar series, which is hosted by the Coexistence Consortium. Before we start today's talk, I would like to give a brief intro about us and the structure of this webinar. We are a network of conservation researchers and practitioners from diverse disciplines, united by a common vision to understand the intricate dynamics of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Our mission extends beyond the conservation of wild animals, confined to distant forest pockets. We emphasize the importance of living well with nature, even in our immediate surroundings. Our collective long-term vision is to employ an experimental and evidence-based approach to catalyze a variety of context-specific human-wildlife coexistence projects worldwide. Now, about the structure of the webinar, our speaker for this evening will be presenting for about 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. I now request Seema Lokanwala, who is also a consortium member, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Anjali. Am I audible? Is this good? Okay. So yeah, Dhee has been like a really good friend, and I know her for now a couple of years, and it's been a pleasure. It's going to be a pleasure introducing her. She's going to start her PhD very soon now. She's a researcher and she's interested in the human dimensions of wildlife conservation, specifically from the point of view of physiology, psychology, and sociocultural factors that shape people's perspective towards wild animals. She has a PhD, she has a master's yet in conservation biology from the School of Anthropology and Conservation at University of Kent, and a BA in psychology from Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her academic work so far includes studying human and leopard interactions in Himachal Pradesh and the worship of Vagoda god, a big cat deity, in the context of human-leopard interaction in Maharashtra. She is curious about human-wildlife entanglements and how they shape and get shaped by the stories, social institutions, and the cultures and histories. Over to you, Dhee.
Thank you so much, Seema. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, is everyone able to see? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for the introduction, Seema, and welcome everyone to the talk today. It's going to be a little bit theoretical and some stories, so hopefully, yeah, it'll be a good balance of the two. So over the next 40 minutes, I'll be sharing some stories and insights that we gain from talking to people in different parts of India with different communities and how they interact with the animals that they live with. So the presentation will be based on 3 studies mainly. So one is my undergrad dissertation, which was on human-bear interactions near Tumkur. And then the second is a project that I did in Himachal Pradesh on human-leopard interactions. And then the third is the research I was involved in Maharashtra on human-big cat interactions. Yeah. So before I get into the talk, I just wanted to do a small poll with everybody. So we have about 10 statements here, and I wanted to request all of you to put in the chat box which statement you resonate with the most out of these 10. Just pick one rather than multiple. Yeah. I'll just give everybody a minute to. Oops, sorry. So I will come back to the responses in a little bit and continue with the talk for now. Yeah. Okay. So my own journey into this field has been a little bit atypical, to say the least. I was a psychology student at Ambedkar University, and when I was studying psychology, I realized that most of what we learn about and most of what we know has to do with how humans interact with other human beings, right? And most of what theories have come out of it is also based almost primarily on human-human interactions. So even if we study animals, we tend to look at how the insight that we try to gain from it seems to be specifically about humans relating to other humans. But there's an absence, I felt, of understanding how humans interact with other animals, other beings, and what are the psychological processes associated with it, and how does our society function, how does our brain function in terms of relating to other beings. Sorry, just a second. It's a little noisy at the back. Just give me a second. Yeah, so I was interested in wildlife, and also I had had some encounters with animals that were honestly quite baffling to me. And I'd also heard about multiple instances of bears mauling people in an area where my parents have a farm close to Bangalore. So I was curious to explore more about how humans relate to animals and what are the factors that contribute towards it. Now, within psychology, one of the most influential schools of thought for me was cultural psychology. So in cultural psychology, there is a recognition that there's no one unified theory of how the mind works and how we operate in this world, right? We think about we know how we think, right? But there's nothing to confirm that everybody thinks in the same way, right? And especially when there is multiple societies and communities across the world with different contexts and socio-political, cultural backgrounds that they're operating from, there is a huge variety and diversity of ways of thinking that exists. And most of what we have understood in psychology comes from a very specific group of people, which, to put broadly, is predominantly undergraduate students in America, right? Because they become the group of subjects that we understand how the mind works from. So this provides a really good base for trying to understand different cultures and scenarios within which people operate and how people think across different cultures. So with that spirit in mind, especially in the context of human-wildlife interactions or human-animal interactions, where the scenario in different places are very different from one another, it made sense for me to consider looking at more inductive ways of understanding how uh, people think rather than go with a unified theory that exists for across the world, right? And across the species. So a couple of disclaimers before I move forward to the specific subject. One disclaimer is that what we're trying to understand here is the subjective truths and perceptions of people, rather than trying to say that this is how an animal is, or this is what the truth is, right? Within the scientific way of operating, we tend to move towards objective truth that exists outside of any specific person's purview, right? But here we're looking at subjective truths according to the perception of people. The second is that we're trying to understand what is rather than defining what should be. And I thought this was important to bring up, especially in the context of conservation, where we often jump to how we should think or how we should be. I think there's value to understanding first how people do think, whether it's good or bad or whatever else according to our moral compass. We need to first understand how people think, what are the factors that operate uh, in how they think, rather than trying to say beforehand, this is how it should be. That. And then third, again, in science, often uh, we think about theories in terms of generalizations that we can make across multiple spaces, but often how those are challenged or how those are critiqued is to look at other anomalies and recognize things and ways of being that don't fit in with the theories that exist. And as those accumulate, we start to reflect on whether theories that we have itself hold good across as much as we think they do. So mine is an attempt of kind of drawing attention to what else and what other ways of thinking also exist in communities across our country, and then see what that does to our notions of what reality is or how we think. So the first study is about human-bear interactions in Karnataka. This was part of my BA thesis. So I'd heard multiple accounts in 2014 about how people had been mauled by bears in the region, and that made me curious with the theoretical background that I had, to look further into it. Also, I didn't know that human-wildlife interactions was even a field and that there were multiple people working on it, because I came from a very different subject background. But from a psychological perspective, I wanted to see how people perceive these animals and what makes it possible for them to continue living with such challenges that exist. So uh, what I expected, because of all the events that I'd heard about, was anger and frustration and, fear and despair. And that was what I went there expecting, because of all the incidents that I'd heard that sounded honestly quite gruesome. But what I encountered there was a very different story, where many people were talking about how bears are part of their everyday life and that they see them regularly and they know where they are and they encounter them quite often. And on top of that, there was also, for example, this quote from one of the interviews that I've put over here. He says, I sleep on this rock and I don't, and he sleeps on that rock. And if I don't do anything, it won't do anything either. Right? So that was a kind of narrative that I hadn't encountered before. And I thought that was very interesting, because it meant that there was frequent interactions, it was part of their everyday reality, and that they weren't constantly questioning the very existence of the bear in their landscape. Right? And there was many interesting things in what they were saying. And one of the things that was very striking was how much they knew about the bears. So there was a lot of detail about how they dig out worms from inside the mud and all of that. But also, which I'll come to later about the observations, but a theme that kept popping up was how the bears are very similar to human beings. Right? So you can see repeatedly, even in these two quotes, that they've been saying they had hands just like us, they tear up jackfruit just like us, and also not just in a physical sense, but also in terms of how they behave and how they act. Because when I asked, do they behave in the same way? They said generally they behave similarly, but sometimes they're different, just like humans, right? So that I thought was something that's quite striking. So now the term for attributing human characteristics to another being is called anthropomorphism, which is considered as a very bad word in science because it's considered as something that affects our ability to study other species well. And it comes from a place of distinguishing ourselves as a species from all other beings and saying us thinking that we are similar to other beings in any way is a bias that we bring in, right? But I mean, that's a debate on its own, and there's a lot of critique more recently about that way of thinking. And especially because the other assumption that's made from dismissing anthropomorphism completely is saying that we are not similar to other animals in any way. But without getting into that too much, I want to draw attention to anthropomorphism in people who live with these animals and whose lived reality is with these species, right? For them, I think anthropomorphism plays a positive role in how they relate with these beings. So the very fact that they identify with another being and identify commonalities and differences means that they're trying to understand the other, right? And that willingness to understand itself is really important, and it can lead to empathy. And not only that, it also leads to a sense of predictability about the other being because they're operating from a place of trying to imagine themselves in the other animal situation and trying to predict how they might act and how they might behave according to what they know and what they understand. So after this study, I did various different things for about 2 years. And then I found myself in Himachal Pradesh doing volunteering for a project on occupancy and diet analysis of leopards in the Hamirpur, Bilaspur, and Mandi districts of Himachal Pradesh. And as we were talking to people there, just casual conversations, there was something very similar in essence to what I'd found with human bear interactions and how people perceive bears in Tumkur to how people were talking about leopards in Himachal Pradesh as well. One of the main similarities was that of the kind of observations and detailed observations people had made about these animals. So for example, they would say they always bite the prey at the neck, at the kukri, or that they drag away prey and eat it somewhere else. And not only that, they knew so much about their mating habits, their territory behavior, and where they go, what they eat, how they look, how they spend their days, what are the seasons. There was many things that they knew about the leopard. And I think this was a big factor in what contributed towards them being able to live with these animals. And in all these descriptions, there was a multifaceted, complex being that they were describing, which was starkly different from the kind of leopards that people would portray in newspapers, in, for example, Jim Corbett books, in other literature that's out there, even in academic papers, the way that these animals are portrayed in terms of an Adamkhor or in terms of a beastly, ghastly, intentionally harmful being. This was a very different, multifaceted portrayal that they were showing. Furthermore, there was also a lot of stories and narratives and experiences that they were explaining. And in the way that they were explaining these animals, there was an essence that was very different. So that was of reciprocity and understanding and response, rather than there was a back and forth between uh, the human and the leopard in how they were describing the experiences they had with the animal. So, for example, this first quote, he talks about how there was a leopard that would come and he ate 40 sheep at one night, right? But when he talks about how he chased him away, he talks about chasing the leopard away, not just for the sake of protecting the sheep that night, but to get him to understand that he'll be harmed if he comes back in this direction, right? So there is a intentionality there that came out through the way that he's describing this. Even in the second excerpt that's here, it talks about how he left a barking deer that the leopard had killed in the forest. He left it there because he felt that if he took it away, then the leopard would come and take his domestic animals, right? So there is a sense of, again, I would like to reiterate that this is not a matter of whether this is the truth, whether leopards come and take domestic sheep away if you take the barking deer, but the fact that he thinks in that way. The shepherd is operating from a place of assuming this kind of reciprocity in the way that humans and animals operate with each other, which was striking for me. In this excerpt again, this is from the bear study before. The interviewee talks about how he came across 4 bears on his way home, and he knew that they don't like lights flashing in their eyes, they won't be able to see. And when he did that, later they realized that he was human and they all stood up with their hands. So again, there is a back and forth between the human and the animal, as opposed to instinct-driven, unidimensional animal that we tend to describe in academic literature and other popular media. So the difference is that of intentionality and agency. So do we as humans grant the capacity for intentionality and agency in other beings? Or do we assume that they would always operate from a place of instinct? Now, again, in behavioral sciences, and especially animal behavior studies, there's a lot of discussions and a lot of studies about whether animals can think, whether they have what we would operationally define as consciousness and all of that. My work is not about that. It's not about whether, I mean, it's an extremely interesting topic, but this is not about whether, in terms of scientific proof, whether animals have what we would define as consciousness. It's more about whether we work from a place of expecting the other being to think and respond rather than act the same way. Now, there's a couple of key discourses in the social sciences that contribute towards this way of thinking. One is posthumanism. Posthumanism looks at expanding our sense of understanding of the world beyond the human to also consider non-human beings. And in the process, they also extend the notions of morality, empathy, companionship to look at not just humans, but also non-humans and the interactions between the two as a whole, between all of them as a whole. So just a small anecdote for extending the notions of morality. This one place where we see this often is in the way that people describe the wasteful behaviors of animals. So when it came to bears as well as leopards, there was, when he said 40 sheep in one night, and he goes on to later explain how he didn't even eat all of them. It's so wasteful. It's so like, just पेट के लिए खा लिया होता तो वो अलग बात है, like if he ate to satisfy his own stomach, that would be a different matter. but if he's eating if he's killing all this for the sake of it, then that's not right, And same with the bears. There was a lady who spoke about how the bear would come and pull out all the groundnuts before they're even ready, and then they would all be hollow. And the sense of wastefulness and how could they do this was very strong in the way that they spoke. And it showed a sense of extending our notions of morality, of what is wasteful, what is right and wrong, to other animals as well, in asking, how could you do this? Yeah. So the other field of study that has contributed significantly to how we understand our relationship with other beings and this multiplicity of perceptions in terms of the others being to think is animism. So anthropologists who have studied animistic cultures across the world have acknowledged that people have different cosmologies, and many animistic cosmologies think of the world as inhabited by human and non-human persons. So these non-human could be animals, plants, mountains, rocks, multiple beings that exist in the world. And they believe that they are all persons with agency, the ability to think, respond, and all of that. So that intersubjectivity and capacity to communicate across beings, right, creates a very different kind of relationship that you have with other beings. Yeah. So these ways of thinking, right, are not do not exist in isolation, right? They come from somewhere, and something sustains this way of thinking across time as well. So culture and stories play an important role in sustaining and, culture and stories play a really important role in defining the way people think about animals. There's a, uh, sorry. So there's a quote that I wanted to read by Karen Armstrong, who talks about myths. And she says, a myth is true because it's effective, not because it gives us factual information. If, however, it does not give us new insight into the deeper meaning of life, it has failed. So we often think about the factual correctness of stories, right? ये तो ऐसा नहीं है. This detail is wrong, that detail is wrong. But the role of myths and stories are not to do with the exact details, but it gives a larger, deeper meaning about the world, and it gives you frameworks through which you can make sense of the world. So in that meaning making, there is a lot that you can identify in stories that contribute towards thinking about other animals as capable of responding. And also, it has a lot of information about these animals as well in the way that they behave, right? So, for example, there's a story that I've put here, which a shepherd told me about, where when Bholenath was distributing food across all the species, the leopard went and hid. And the shepherd explains he can be very small when he wants, and when he's about to attack, he can become very big, right? And after everyone has been given food, the leopard comes out of hiding and he says, "Where's the food for me?" And in response, Bholenath then tells him that everything is available to him and he can eat whatever he wants. So that's how the shepherd was explaining that he can eat whatever he wants, but he's very protective of the whatever he manages to catch. So the slyness of the animal is also embedded within the way that the story is framed. And also many details of observation about the animal's behavior is also embedded within the stories themselves. So paying attention to the stories can give us a lot of insight into how people think and respond to these animals. And this came out most significantly when we were working in Maharashtra to understand the social institution of Vagoba. A colleague and friend of mine, Ramya Nayan, did the ethnography there and did qualitative interviews to understand what are the socio-cultural significance of this big cat deity named Vagoba. Mainly, it's the Wadlis who believe in Vagoba, but also many other communities and cultures around there. So there was not only bits of stories, but there was a whole belief system around the deity Vagoba. And in those stories, and there were several origin stories, so we've tried to condense it into one narrative that we've presented here. But Vagoba, it's believed, was the son of a princess or chieftain's daughter. And he would shapeshift. When he was a baby, he would shapeshift into a tiger and go kill livestock when the princess was out washing clothes and doing other things. And the villagers got scared and wanted to kill the tiger. Therefore, the woman, the mother, mediated a relationship with the tiger such that the tiger would be in the forest, while in exchange, they would be giving Vaguba sacrifice every year to satiate him. And this exchange of giving a sacrifice happens every year, even now, on a day called Vagbaras. So why I'm drawing your attention to this is because there is the capacity to negotiate that comes across here very strongly in the way that the relationship between the humans and the tigers and leopards are defined. And that follows, I would argue, from considering other animals as thinking beings, because it's only when you believe that the other being can respond, would you be willing to negotiate. And that willingness to negotiate, I think, is key for coexistence, because that, I think, is what makes it possible for us to maintain and continue a relationship despite all the changes and dynamic ways of the world. And not only that, I think these stories are really important because they have embedded within the stories and beliefs, all the different factors and all the different ways of thinking within it. And through practice such as Vagbaras, which happens every year, these beliefs also get reinforced and perpetuates, and there is an intergenerational transfer of these ideas and notions about other beings that happens through these stories and narratives. Yeah. So I would like to go back to the question that we asked in the beginning about what you think of as, sorry, I'm just going to, because I want to open this out to questions now. So considering which statement you identified with the most, I wanted all of you to think back and go, if we think of others as thinking beings, right? And whichever number you were at across those different statements, how would you envision conservation and coexistence to be? And where are we operating from now in terms of how we treat other beings, whether it be human, non-human, plants, animals, rocks, even. How do we envision conservation to be if we afforded more capacity in the beings around us? So on that note, I will stop here. And this is credits. Yeah. Thank you.
We are now open for question and answers.
Yes.
I think Anu has her hands up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, Dhee. I thought it was such an important one. I just wondered why you used the term thinking and not sentient. Because, yeah, I just wanted to know why the term thinking and not sentient.
I think I use the word thinking because it translates the best across languages. I wasn't trying to define, like operationally define thinking. It was more of a self-report across multiple communities. So for example, sochna is something that you can like, kya जानवर सोचते हैं क्या is something that I could ask and talk about in other languages. But yeah, that's where the translation came from. It was just a literal translation across. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, Rihanna, I think if you would like to unmute yourself and ask, please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Yeah.
Okay, hi. So, good evening and thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Uh, Going back to the question you left us with, right? So,
Yeah.
amongst your very first slides, you mentioned anthropomorphism and you mentioned predictability within that, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, just going away from wildlife as such, as someone who loves dogs and owns dogs, I know that that predictability for someone who has been near dogs and has grown up in dogs is kind of as a, it's assumed we understand the dog won't jump you and bite you or without any reason or just run and bite you. But even in the simple case of human society where people are afraid of dogs, for
Yeah.
them the standard statement you hear from them is like, "पता नहीं जानवर है कोई भरोसा नहीं है." They will like shift to the other side of the road. They just run away like it's almost like they think of an animal as a mad rabbit creature, which will just, it's just waiting, the teeth is there only to bite.
Yeah.
So I think if we can address that question, if we can think of ways to say make people more comfortable with dogs, for example. People are afraid of dogs. How do you convey the fact that this animal is just going about his daily business? It's not going to run and bite you just because it has. We can resolve something like people's fear of dogs. I think we can possibly extend that to people's fear of other wildlife as well. But that's the critical question, that people who have grown up near a particular animal, for example, I live in Dehradun, right?
Mhm.
And I came from Calcutta. So when I first came to Dehradun, I work at the Wildlife Institute of India. We have a leopard that kind of comes and goes on campus. And when I started working here, I was terribly afraid of the idea that there's a leopard on campus. I would not go on the trail alone, on those kind of things. But now that I've lived here for a while, I kind of get a sense that, okay, yes, the animal is something we need to be aware of, but then it has its own cycle and it has its own territory as such. So it won't really jump. It's not a serial killer waiting for you to kind of find a lonely spot and kill you. So that, I think, I don't know, maybe that's the critical question to answer, that how to translate to people that forget about thinking that these animals are not really, automatons or robots who are just waiting to stab you or kill you or run you down, that kind of thing. So that's something which, again, I've seen people who come on campus to train. Once they hear that there's a leopard on campus, you can see their behavior change, sometimes unnecessarily so. Maybe that's something to think about. That out. Thank you.
Thanks, Anuranjan. Rana?
Yeah, thank you. So as always, Onu, She's just written down the question that I had, which is basically this, that instead of thinking about thinking, for the purposes of identification, for the purposes of promoting coexistence, conservation, etc., sentience, which also Anu refers to here, sentience may actually be a quality which is more easily palpable, which I think humans would be able to identify with, not only because they are undergoing sentient feelings all the time, but also the behavioral monitors of sentience may be much more simple to decipher in another being rather than the capacity to think, let us say. And the other interesting connection that is now coming up in the natural sciences is this very close linkage with between consciousness, which you also touched upon and decided not to talk about it right now, consciousness and sentience. And in fact, there has been very strong arguments put forward that if you're sentient, you're also conscious. And you cannot have consciousness without sentience, and to a certain extent, perhaps, and that may be a bit of a circular argument, which came first, but again, also the argument that if you're conscious, you're very likely to be sentient. So I was just wondering, Dhee, whether you would respond to this in terms of whether we should now perhaps bring some amount of focus into thinking about sentience, which people might be able to recognize much more easily. Thanks. But wonderful talk. Wonderful talk.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be honest, I haven't gotten into the nitty-gritties of what words to use. Also, as I said, it was all three studies were inductive studies, right? So it was more of a translating from what people said, as opposed to defining what I'm looking for and then going back with those questions. I mean, it's great that there are words in Bengali for these, but I didn't come across something that translates from anubhuti or sentience in whatever people had said. So I just would be careful about using terms that didn't come up, and therefore I've avoided it. But definitely, I think we need to think more about what are the qualities that we are considering and what becomes important in, because thinking has more to do with a rationality and a capacity to respond, right? Whereas sentience is more about the ability to feel and comprehend. So while I think there is a deducibility in people about the capacity of another to think, in terms of capacity for another to feel is something that is very hard to get at. But of course, it is. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
No, I may not completely agree with you, but we should debate this sometime.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Thank you, Rana.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from Sai. Even thinking has two types, type 1 and type 2, according to Kahneman. And type 1 thinking often relates to executive function and sentient as we are now describing it. I think it's more of a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I would like to reiterate, though, that what I'm referring to doesn't have as much to do with whether an animal can think or not, because the methodologies I've used are not conducive to that. It's more about whether people consider a capacity in other beings to think. Yeah. Yeah, Nitin.
Hello, Dhee. Sorry, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
Very cool talk, Dhee. So I am curious about, I guess, the extent to which this attribution of thinking or maybe even feeling ability goes in the communities you work with, and whether there are any patterns. So I guess I'm curious because, like, bears and leopards are powerful animals, right? So for people living in the communities, naturally they sort of have to contend with that power. I know monkeys, like the ones Rana's studies are, maybe a nuisance sometimes, but also look like people. And so there's some, there's another reason. I guess I'm curious, like, could you kind of, across the communities you work with, can you trace out a pattern as to what animals people sort of tend to attribute these capacities to? And especially like do broiler chickens ever come up as thinking creatures? Because I at least in my experience, I find that a lot of communities otherwise attribute sort of thinking abilities to all sorts of species, cut out an exception for the animals they eat, especially broiler chickens.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I haven't, to be honest, because I've worked on very specific species on specific places, I don't know how much I can generalize. But responding to what you said on broiler chickens, and this is something that came up in my work in Himachal as well as Radhika Govindrajan's work in Uttarakhand as well, that there was a sense of insider and outsider that contributed to how people perceive these animals. So in Himachal, they had a distinction between the jungly mirg, and mirg was the term that is traditionally used to refer to leopards, and then they would say paltu tendua, which is which they would attribute to animals that have been left by the forest department in the area for various reasons. And there's a whole conspiracy theory about it and all of that. And many of the behaviors of leopards that they did not like, they attributed to it being a paltu tendwa that's been left by the department and has been, brought up in zoos and therefore are not scared of humans, and they don't play by the rules of the rest of the animals. So I think even within species, there are distinctions that people can make. And in Uttarakhand's case, they spoke about like the outsider monkeys and insider monkeys and how they behave differently, and they don't respond the same way as our monkeys would do, and so on. So that, I think, might be something interesting to look at in terms of broiler chickens as opposed to their own chickens, whether they think of them as being different from each other. Yeah.
Thanks, Dhee.
Thanks. Sakshi?
Hi, Dhee, and thank you for the very insightful session, and also to Coexistence Consortium for organizing this. My question is, I think I'm going back to very basics from what I've seen when I've grown up and how I am living today. So, from your study and your thesis and also the extended studies that you have done, it focuses currently on people who live very close to the wildlife. But if I think of myself and a lot of people who are very isolated when it comes to the different nature elements of nature, I do get a sense of being extremely afraid of these elements. At the same time, there's a feeling of deprivation. I just feel that this is not the correct way of living. Now, there are two choices. Either you leave all of this and you go and make a settlement, or you settle in a place that's closer to the nature, or otherwise there has to be more development of methods, how we teach. I think I've grown up a lot now, and it's difficult for me to digest a few of concepts, but I want the next generation at least to be brought up in a manner. When I say next generation, I'm meaning people who are very isolated, who are living in cities very far away from nature, to have those methods in which they feel at least some part connected to the nature. Because I very sincerely believe that humans have lost that basic idea that we too are nature. We are not separate from these different elements that exist. So your stories had these elements of example of stories. Like stories are one way of communicating that. But for people who are so far away and who have never seen those things in practical life, are there any other examples or things that you feel should be done, or if the study could be extended to that, or if it already exists, if you could share that with me, that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Sakshi. Sorry, I'm going to problematize what you asked. One, I don't know about this whole entity of nature. I would also ask, how do you relate with the rat that's around your house? Because that's also part of the same narrative, right? Like it's also,
Correct.
yeah. So I think we need to also reflect on the beings that are there around us. Like, how
Hmm.
do you distinguish from how you relate to a squirrel as opposed to a rat? Where's the difference coming from in how
No,
you?
there is absolutely no difference when it comes to different elements. So you're absolutely correct that there are existing beings that are there even in the environment that I'm living with. But at the same time, it's very limited. Like a majority of the species appear very far away. Majority of these elements appear very far away.
Yeah, but I would argue that the attitudes and ways of thinking that we're discussing here can
Mm-hmm.
be can be applicable across all these scenarios, right? And also, I don't know if we have learned enough to really start talking about what should be and how it should be and what is the right way of thinking.
Correct.
But to
So
teach the next generation or whatever else, I think we need to start thinking about what are the creatures around us, who are we willing to live with and live alongside, and what are the challenges that come in that, and pay attention to how we resolve those and how we work with those and extend that to how we understand the larger world is what.
that makes absolute sense. So actually, just to add a very small point, most of our problem solving when dealing with these relatively um, other species that we stay in close vicinity with are to make them away from us. Like at least majority, like we tend to move away from insects. We try to avoid having them in our house, even with the example that you gave, rats. So the idea would be to be as away from them as possible and see them from a distance so that we're not impacted in our day-to-day life. So if that is the idea, do you think that, like, how do we inculcate that feeling of being together even with these smaller elements that we see around us? Because I completely agree that you're completely right that it starts with the elements that we already have in our vicinity, and how we behave with them is our extension of how we will
Yeah,
behave with the other.
yeah. Yeah, no, I don't have an answer for that. I mean, honestly, I struggle with it in my own life, so I can't really say what to do with. I mean, when there's a rat in my house, I like do consider killing it, and I do kill them. So, you know,
Yeah,
yeah, and it
yeah, I
doesn't
think it's more
like, and
complicated.
also, yeah, and also coexistence. I mean, as we're talking about it, is not, I don't think we know enough to say that no killing means that is good. If there's any killing, it means it's bad. Those are not the distinctions that we're making. But as you rightly pointed out, whether we are okay with other beings in our vicinity or we consider ourselves as isolated physically, psychologically from other beings, and that's the direction we should go in, that's definitely something we need to reflect on, and we need to see how the stories that we produce and we take forward reflect that way of thinking. Yeah.
Thank you, Dhee.
Thank you, Sakshi. If you have no more questions, we can wrap up for the day. We are right on time. Thanks for a lovely, lovely talk, Dhee. It's always nice to listen to you talk. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We are a monthly webinar series, so do follow us in our socials to know about our next talk. I've added the details of our socials in the chat box. Thanks again for joining us. Have a nice evening.